There is no denying the UFC is a landmark event in the history of the sport. And to be honest, it's insane we even got to this point. So to celebrate that we made it all the way here, I decided to run the numbers in the UFC events. And to give you an overview of where we started, where we are, and where we're going. But first, to get started, I do want to clear something up about these eras. UFC 300 is only UFC 300 in name. Because any other way you look at it, UFC 300 is not the 300th of anything. Of course, it's another 300th UFC event that they've put. It is in fact the 687th. This is because of all the UFC Fight Night shows that get aired on TV and not pay-per-view. It is not the 300th event pay-per-view either. When you factor in the non-numbered pay-per-views of the pre-Zuffa era and several cancellations and the 7 numbered fight cards that got aired for free on Spike TV. UFC 300 is actually the 291st pay-per-view event. But hey, UFC 300 has to be the 300th numbered pay-per-view card, right? We all know how to count 1 through 300.
Now you can only count the 5.
Well, no actually, because the UFC had a couple half-numbered pay-per-views.
Hi again, everybody, and welcome to what we're calling UFC 37 and a half.
And if you consider the 3 events that have been canceled outright, factoring all that in, UFC 300 is actually number 302 of all the numbered pay-per-views. So yeah, this whole thing is a lie. But great, now that we cleared that up, throughout this 300 events, what city has given the UFC the most amount of money? And as you would have guessed, the same city that UFC 300 is taking place in, Las Vegas, the city of lost wages. But what is number 2? Actually, it's Canada, 21. Most of them during the GSP era. There has been 20 cards in California, 14 cards in Texas, 13 in New Jersey, a vital location for getting the sport sanctioned, and the UK and Brazil actually share a spot with 12 pay-per-views. The newest of the top locales is New York with 11, Abu Dhabi has 9, and Australia has 8. And all the cards up to 300 have collectively earned a total of $840,122,255 on total disclosed gates. Now that's a giant number. However, it's a giant number. Now it's a number that for the sake of the channel, I think is a great number, but it doesn't really tell you the whole story. So let's actually break it up by eras. So in the first 100 events, the disclosed gates were $143,944,137, with the average gate being around $2.5 million. With events from 100 to 200, as you can imagine, there's a substantial bump because now the sport is fully legal. And these 100 events totaled 280 million closed gates, with an average of 3.1 million per show. But here's where things get crazy though. From UFC 200 to UFC 300, there's been a total spike to $415,836,979, with gates averaging now $5.3 million, and that is ridiculous, especially considering the arenas haven't gotten any bigger. So after we discovered that, we wanted to figure out how much have tickets increased, because I was gonna go to UFC 299 myself down there in Miami. Well, I gotta be honest, I wasn't about to pay $5,000 for a ticket. Between 1 to 100, it was about 190 bucks. From 100 to 200 is about 200 bucks. From 200 to 300 is $305. You gotta take out a second mortgage to go to UFC events now. What is crazy is that UFC is not even making the majority of their money from ticket sales. After all, this is a company that reportedly drove in $1.3 billion in revenue just last year. That is more than every disclosed gate combined. Their big money makers are sponsorships, merch, right fees, and pay-per-view buys. Now, unfortunately, the UFC has not been as forthcoming with their buy rates in recent years. But that didn't stop me from finding every single one available out there right now, and then dividing them by all 3 time periods and seeing how that has progressed. The average between UFC 1 and 100 is 338,000. Not a bad number considering the promotion's early struggles. And that would see a pretty sizable boost in the eras from 100 to 200 with 480,000 buys per pay-per-view. Now obviously the modern era is harder to pin down because they're an ESPN and they try not to disclose those numbers now. Now with the numbers that we were able to find out, it's an astronomical number. And it is a total of 607,000 views on average per pay-per-view. Now, you gotta take that with a grain of salt because it could be the result of a lack of data or the UFC just putting out their massive numbers to flex on people. That's where we're at now. How did we get here? Let's backtrack to check out the history and see where it all started. Now, technically, this goes all the way back to thousands of years ago in ancient Greece, but I already made a whole video about that, so if you're interested, you can check that video out. I'm gonna start over here in the late 80s and early 90s in Brazil and Japan with the Vale Tudo events. But essentially, all you need to know is both ancient Greece, Brazil, and Japan all have their history connected by journeymen that would travel all across the world. But the story of the UFC started at UFC 1. And this is more clearly the beginning of the no-holds-barred era. Early UFC is so damn compelling. Sure, it was an infomercial for the Gracies, but what a pitch, especially for the uninitiated. All these different fighters from these different backgrounds fighting each other with no rules. These pay-per-views were so much fun to watch, and yes, they were raw and it didn't have a lot of great fighting, but it had the legends of the era, Ken Shamrock, Dan Severn, Royce Gracie. We were learning so much from them. But unfortunately, it was a little too much fun because it led to the dark ages. Yes, all that marketing about having no rules and people nearly dying, well, it came back to bite them. Because as raw as it seemed and as great as it seemed, it also was almost like human cockfighting. And I know that that's a famous phrase to refer to it as, but it's true. It got them banned all over the United States. And most pay-per-view providers wouldn't even air this stuff. In fact, this is what led to the death of ECW, but I digress. It was nearly impossible to watch because nobody wanted to have it. Even home video stopped the release of UFC 22. So did anything good happen from the dark eras? Yes, actually. So the dark eras helped establish some rules and give the fighters gloves, big steps in what would soon become a legitimate sport and help with the image. Essentially, the modern version of the sport was created from this era, as was the mixing of styles with guys like Maurice Smith, Randy Couture, demonstrating the dominance of Greco-Roman, Vitor Belfort, Frank Shamrock, Pat Miletich in his fighting system, and the beginnings of Tito Ortiz. All these are fascinating to look at now and seeing everything come together like it was. But as the UFC was dying and politicians were making sure that the UFC did die, something interesting was happening in the other side of the globe. Turns out that Japan saw UFC 1 as well, and they wanted their own version of it. They wanted the Gracies too, so it started with Vale Tudo Japan, and they wanted Hickson. And Pride 1 was promoted with Nobuhiro Takada and Hickson himself in front of 48,000 people. A one-off event that created a golden age in the sport. Because while MMA was an absolute swaller in the US, it was thriving in Japan. And this one-off event became a whole promotion known as Pride, and they had all the best fighters and all the best of everything. And even though it did take some time, something interesting ended up happening in the US. That dying promotion, the UFC, a bald guy and his billionaire buddies bought it to start the Zuffa era. They started marketing harder to the young age of 18 to 34, and while the Fertittas were hemorrhaging money to keep this thing alive, because nobody was watching, they were still making pretty smart moves with the company. They got themselves with cable TV sports show. They marketed the heck out of Tito Ortiz versus Ken Shamrock, Chuck Liddell, who both just screamed 2002. They were taking all the right steps, all the pieces were there, and the UFC became that hip thing to watch again. And they were right on the cusp as they were about to reach bankruptcy. All they really needed was a spark, and they got it in the form of The Ultimate Fighter.
This is the true story
Of 16 strangers
picked to live in a house and have their lives taped.
To find out what happened.
When people stop being polite,
start kicking the out of each other.
Okay, why don't you knock me out?
The Ultimate Fighter. 16 guys vying for 2 contracts in the UFC, living together, training together, and fighting each other.
It's difficult to fight your friends. I'll take him down, pound his ass.
The Ultimate Fighter. Premieres Monday after Raw, only on Spike TV.
The year previous, the UFC had only put on 5 events. With the added Spike TV fight cards, they would double again. And now their fighters would become mega stars. Back in Japan, Pride was still on top of the sport, until it abruptly died thanks to their gangster owners getting jammed up. So now the UFC, rolling 2 years into the boom, decided to buy their library, their name, and bought their biggest stars, minus Fedor, who you can also watch a video about, to make him even more of a juggernaut. All this success will culminate with a deal with the network television, a 7-year partnership with Fox Sports. When the dust had settled on the boom, the UFC was the only thing left standing. They had purchased Pride and all of his competitors. It was time for world domination. Velasquez, Aldo, Jones, St. Pierre, Silva, Cruz, Johnson. The era of world domination had kicked off with the most dominant group of champions that the world had ever seen. The greatness of the UFC was no longer in question. Truly the best of the best fought there. Thanks to the rise of the first woman fighting superstar, Ronda Rousey, alongside an Irishman that nobody saw coming. UFC doubled their event, peaking at an absurd 46 events in 2014. GSP left, Silva fell, Dillashaw became champ. We learned about TRT just long enough for it to get banned as Vitor Belfort destroyed the middleweight division. Chael Sonnen, so massively influential in the previous era, would be forced to retire temporarily due to PEDs. The brief period after the boom truly felt like it was the peak. It felt like those levels could never be reached again. Man, were we wrong, because Ronda and Conor would turn out to be megastars and had taken it to a level that we had never been seen before. And with all this attention, the UFC tightened the ship up. Drug problems, not anymore. Bring in USADA. Fighters are walking out there with Condom Depot written in their ass and getting money for it, not on our watch. Sponsors are done and everybody is wearing their sponsorships now. We just made a big money deal with Reebok. And we didn't know this, but Zuffa was getting ready to sell the UFC. With Conor and Ronda Mania going crazy, the UFC was at peak time to sell for $4 billion. And all this massive mainstream success will culminate with the UFC signing another TV deal, when the promotion partnered with a worldwide leader in sports to kick off the ESPN era. No longer was pay-per-view the end-all be-all of the business. The world was changing, everybody was cutting the cord, and streaming was the future. And for the UFC, ESPN's new streaming service was the jackpot, and the UFC was on fire, the rise of the contender era. And all of a sudden, it all reached a screeching halt.
You know, we have no choice now but to postpone these fights. So we're postponing the next 3 events, and we're hoping that this all clears up, you know, by April.
That's right, it's time to talk about the pandemic era. With the whole world shutting down because of COVID, the UFC lost an unprecedented 5 events in a row, eventually bucking to in the trend with other sports and firing things back up right in the middle of the pandemic. Primarily in the UFC Apex with 0 crowd, minus a few events with very few people in Abu Dhabi. With the UFC getting scared of the US shutting down the UFC in general and its events, UFC partnered with the UAE to create Fight Island, one of the best marketing campaigns the promotion has ever gone through for something that was honestly kind of trivial. Some crazy things that happened in this time though. Khabib retired as a champ, Stipe against DC. DC cemented his legacy as a middleweight. Max Holloway went God mode. Dustin Poirier and Conor McGregor was a very massive hit for a brief period of time. And finally, in April of 2021, the UFC would be back in crowds. And they came out of the Pandy Prime to the modern era, breaking records. So here we are, it is today. UFC 300 just happened, and they're still breaking records.
Arena record broke the arena record. The new arena record broke our own record. The arena record. 8 of 8 pay-per-view sellouts this year ever since we brought fans back. 14th consecutive sellout. 21 consecutive sellouts. 27th consecutive sellout.
After the pandemic, the UFC went full speed ahead. Their value since their sales to Endeavor had tripled. They decided to keep holding UFC events at the UFC Apex, likely saving tons of money. They doubled and tripled down in the UFC Contender Series signings. Conor is still Conoring, and their parent company bought the WWE as well, merging the UFC and the WWE in a company called TKO Holdings now. Now what will define this current era is still to be seen, but this is where we're at now. But please let me know down in the comments which era was your favorite era. But what can we expect from the UFC going into the future? The UFC is threatened with competition. Even though it might not seem realistic, check out this video to see how one company might beat the UFC. However, the UFC has so much money that they could honestly maybe be untouchable. But signing this one deal with Nike might make him even more untouchable. So check out those videos and I'll see you in those. See ya!
It's all on the coat. Ballin' now, skirt down. All of these diamonds sold. Bought them for me, but they're yours now. You could drink it, but take it slow. Ballin' for you, falling